Welcome to State of Ed, a podcast about education inside the classroom and out. My name is Marc.
And I'm Nick Simone.
How you doing today, Nick?
You're doing well. Yourself?
Can't complain. It's a beautiful day. We've been getting some nice weather. It's not oppressively hot here in New York. It's just sort of comfortable with a little bit of humidity, but nothing too crazy. So I really can't complain at all.
Oh, that's very good. And how are things at school for the summer months?
So far, a little bit on the quiet side, which is I have no complaints there either. But I know that it won't last because there's always something else around the corner that's waiting. I just don't know what it is yet. That's the fun of the job, is that there's always something that's waiting for you around the corner, and you do find out at some point. You just hope it's not too terrible. You're always waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Right.
But so far, so good. That's the important thing. I know we have some news in the state ed department, and I think you had brought that to my attention a little while ago. Can you fill in our viewers or our listeners?
I actually just saw it about an hour ago. One of New York's education officials, Dr. Ken Wagner, who was instrumental in the Engage New York website. Have you guys used that a lot at your school?
Like everything else, we have some teachers who swear by it and are on it all the time, and we have some teachers who visit it occasionally, and we have others who don't know it's there. But that's a minority of teachers for sure.
Okay. Well, he was really behind that, and from the number of hits that the website's receiving, it does seem like it's been very successful. And I think they've also been able to track that people from other states have been using it, obviously, as well. Anyway, he will no longer be with us. Another official has left, and he will be the new Commissioner of Education for the state of Rhode Island. So now we've lost Dr. King and Dr. Wagner.
Well, Dr. King, I'm not I haven't lost too much sleep with him being gone. But,
no, not at all.
But I don't know. It seems like anything that can help teachers collaborate and not have to reinvent the wheel is a step in the right direction. So if Ken Wagner is in some way, shape, or form responsible for that in terms of Engage New York, it's a step in the right direction for sure.
Well, he has an interesting background. Now obviously in Rhode Island, they're all trying to get to know him, and one of the websites put together information about him. He was on the school board in Seaford at the age of 18.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he's a school psychologist. That's how he began in Freeport. So he's a Long Island, for most of his career, Long Island educator. And he's worked his way up. He went through, Shoreham, Wading River, and BOCES. But I did watch, there was a video of him speaking about data. I think I mentioned this to you. And he really tried to sell teachers on the need for using student test scores as feedback for themselves. That it's instrumental, he kept saying, in them trying to improve, and that kids need to be challenged. He was using the argument that if a kid is not challenged in fourth grade and they don't face obstacles, then by the time they're in high school, they won't be able to deal with this and won't be able to get a job. He was trying to make that bridge and that connection.
Oh my God.
I know. And now of course, I think we all want kids to be challenged, but there's a way to challenge a 6-year-old that
they have to be challenged appropriately for their grade level and their development stage.
Of course. And it just goes back to the same argument that we just keep having. And I just get so frustrated because I don't feel as if I need to see some of these people in these positions just come out and say that education first and foremost is about making connection with kids and trying to help young people. It's not about numbers. It's not about test scores. That's a great tool to use in the process, but it's just not what we're supposed to be doing. At least that's not why I went into the profession.
Well, you went into the profession before the age of big data,
right?
Or data, and they're transforming it. They're trying to use the business model and get as much in terms of information and numbers as they can, so they can crunch it, so they can read the tea leaves and understand what's going on and figure out where things are going. The problem is, or the thing that they're not really giving credence to, is that you could do the same thing in your classroom working with students every single day. You can have a very good handle, perhaps in many ways even more enlightened handle, on how they're doing and where they are and what they need, because the data doesn't, the data will tell you what you want it to tell you.
Right.
And I don't care how many numbers you have and what kind of statistics, you will make it tell the story that you want it to tell. And the place where you can't do that, the place where reality rules, is in the classroom when you're dealing with the student, and the things that you can't deny, that are truths that present themselves to you. And so those two worlds clash, and that's why we have such a disconnect between what we're doing on our level and what they're doing on their level.
There's no question. And again, it's discouraging, because then you just continue to hear stories of young people in the news. Look at Chicago, right? Last weekend, what was it? 9 people dead, 46 people injured one weekend. Whenever I see these stories, those in their 20s, they were in a classroom a few years ago. These people
That's right.
were in a classroom a few years ago, and we failed them. We haven't, now, not just us, of course, but the system it's not meeting everybody's needs. Engage New York has some wonderful ideas on it. It's a great tool. But Engage New York is not going to help everybody. And I think that's their mentality. He even went on, he was talking about, well, because they love their modules, and if you provide a curriculum mapping in a module, he says, well, some people might take it in a different direction. And he called that a fork. And he goes, I guess that's okay. He wasn't my idea. I love when teachers are creative. Why do we want to make teachers robots? Engage New York should not be a tool where we tell every teacher, here's a script, do this in the classroom, and that'll achieve your goal. That's not what teaching is. There's no question.
Right.
You get ideas from people. Some of the best things I do I've gotten from other people. But there's nothing wrong with teachers going in a different direction and being creative in the classroom.
Of course. Well, that's always a fear, that they'll go on Engage New York and they'll say, okay, I guess this is what I've been instructed to teach and how I've been instructed to teach it.
Right.
And that is the furthest thing from the truth. We want teachers to go on there and get ideas, be inspired, have your eyes opened to a new direction that you could go in, but ultimately using your experience and using your talents and using your creativity, figure out what works best for your students.
Of course. And
there's no group of students, than like the students in your class.
Of course. And I hear elementary school teachers complain the most about this, that they're almost being handed a script for what they're supposed to teach to get these kids ready for these tests. So,
and when they're supposed to teach it,
right.
Based on, the research says that if they read within 20 minutes of waking up, then that's the best, or they should read later in the day, or they should read after lunch or before lunch, or do math, at 2 o'clock instead of 1 o'clock. It's when the angle of the sun is 22 degrees, that's the best time to learn about geometry. I mean, the whole thing is absolutely outrageous. If you have a great math teacher or a great elementary school teacher who's great at teaching math, she could teach that at midnight or at 6 in the morning or at noon. It won't make a difference. Kids will learn. So please take the statistics and put them where the sun doesn't shine.
Well, we'll see how things go in Rhode Island for Dr. Wagner. So I wish him.
I'm sure they'll go perfectly well. I have no faith. I was about to say I have no faith. That's a Freudian slip. I was trying to be sarcastic and say I have no doubt, but I guess my subconscious got the better of me. Yeah. Speaking of conscious and subconscious and the inner workings of the mind, just a little follow-up to our little discussion on Inside Out from last time. There was a really great article in the Times that came out this week discussing the science behind Inside Out, and actually was written by one or two individuals who were tapped by Pete Docter and his creative team to really get a little bit better understanding of how the brain works, so they could sort of shape their story around that. And it was really interesting. I'll put a link to it in our show notes. But I really, again, thinking back to the movie, loved it so much. And if you're working with especially pre-adolescents, it's such an essential movie to see. It's very entertaining, but it really hits home, and you'll see a lot of things that you notice in terms of behavior and the changing of behavior in young people around that age, and it's really a wonderful, wonderful thing.
All right, sounds good.
Highly endorse it. So let's get into our topics for this week. And one of the things I wanted to discuss, and it's been a long-standing issue, is the issue of cell phones in school and cell phones in class in particular. And I know New York City just relented on its very draconian rules, where they literally had a zero tolerance for cell phones, where they would have vans parked outside of schools, and kids would be required to drop off their phones in these cell phone vans and pick them up at the end of the school days to ensure that they wouldn't be in the classrooms.
Well, that was entrepreneurship. Those were people that were charging them each day to put their cell phones there.
That wasn't a voluntary thing?
No. So somebody came up with a great idea to get these cell phone vans. But you're right. You're right.
And they must have ticked somebody off because now they're gone. So
Yes.
I get, instead of, the ice cream man will be outside like he was when I went to school, and everyone can get their snow cone and then drop it when they try to take it out of the plastic. But so I jotted down a couple of questions and I wanted to walk through them with you regarding cell phones. And one, in terms of classroom management, just using the city idea for a minute, how do cell phones in classrooms impact classroom management?
Well, as far as in the actual classroom, I have taken the approach that it is better to incorporate the cell phones rather than try to constantly fight against the cell phones. And I think that they can be a big positive in the learning environment. For something as simple as when there's a question that nobody knows the answer to, myself included, something in history, the kids can just look it up 2 seconds and get you the answer. Instead of having to wait until the next day to get the answer. I've used interactive polls. There's a website, polleverywhere.com, where you can put up a question with various choices, and as the kids enter in the codes, it'll slide back and forth with the percentage of each answer. It's something as simple as, who's your favorite president of the post-World War II era? And you put 6 names up there, and the kid puts in the answer. You could even have, if you have confidence in your students, you could have them ask questions using the cell phone on Poll Everywhere, where it'll just appear as a question on the screen. So there's a lot of different ways I think that the cell phone can be helpful in the classroom. This summer,
But you're talking about, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, okay. I haven't used it yet, but I was a little bit. I've just been frustrated the last couple of years that I don't feel as if every student is really mastering everything that I'm teaching in class. And I think one of the reasons is because a lot of kids are still reluctant to ask. They are very intimidated about appearing like they're not as smart as some of the other kids. So I've been trying to, you try a million different tools, and you've heard of people with their exit tickets where teachers well, apparently there's an app for that. Surprise, surprise, that you can do that. It's called Exit Ticket. And that's something I plan on doing this year, but I haven't really investigated. My point is that there's just an endless number of apps and tools and devices, ways that these devices can be used. And I think instead of trying to fight it, it's better off to embrace it. I think it makes the environment a lot more conducive for the students to learn. I think I mentioned to you, a long time ago, I went to a conference in New Jersey that was just a full tech conference. Now, this is 10 years ago now. And they were so far ahead of everybody else. And it was all from the principal. Sorry, I don't remember his name, but he was extraordinary. And he said, I'm going to create now this was in the 20th century. I'm going to create a 21st century school. And I just think it's better. So anyway, what was your follow-up question?
Well, just to touch upon a couple of things that you said. One, for those who aren't aware, an exit ticket essentially is a tool or a device that a teacher can use at the end of a lesson. They simply hand the student an exit ticket, and they it's sort of an extension to the lesson where they can either write something down very briefly and hand it into the teacher on the way out. That's typically how they work, or sometimes the teacher hands them the exit ticket and they complete it and they give it in the next day. That's a little bit more similar to homework, but typically the way the exit ticket is used is they write a thought or two, usually something connected to the final summary of the lesson, and they hand it into the teacher on their way out, so the teacher can have a better understanding and assess how much of the lesson the students understood. But what you're talking about, Nick, is essentially how to use cell phones to help with instruction. But what I'm talking about is the impact that cell phones have on classroom management. So let me share a little bit from the administrative side and where cell phones become very problematic. In each and every classroom, teachers have established, their world and their rules and their environment. Now, of course, there are building rules, but you know as well as I do that when a teacher goes into his or her room, there's a significant sense of this is, I'm the master of my domain attitude, which is completely understandable, and that's part of what goes on in the teacher's classroom. But the way cell phones are handled in different classrooms is widely different based on who's standing in front of the room. And very often when we have issues that arise, disciplinary issues that arise, they are related to the cell phone in one way, shape, or form. And as you hear the story very often includes, I had my cell phone out and then I put it away, or then I didn't put it away, but the teacher asked, or I had it in my bag, but I didn't think the teacher saw it, or I was just checking for the time, or my mother had texted me. So a lot of these stories start to surface, and they wind up creating very disruptive classroom management scenarios, which often lead to some form of discipline down the road. So administratively, one of the challenges is to try to figure out how do we can't stem the tide, right? The technology is here, cell phones are here. We have to make sure that teachers aren't using it in the classroom for their personal use, in addition to kids. Which is a growing problem because we are all just kind of addicted to our screens. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So the question is, how do we try to minimize or mitigate the classroom management issues that are connected to cell phones? So what are some of your thoughts in terms of your perspective in the classroom?
Well, you kind of took the whole problem together there. And with that approach, as a school, I think if you want everybody on the same page, well, then you have to create a rule where either they can use them or they can't. Because if your concern is that there is some teachers that allow it and some, see, I don't see a problem with that. But if from your end, if there is a problem, then it has to be addressed. If you think that administrators are frustrated by the fact that some teachers are having issues and others aren't. I don't know if I explained that well enough. In other words, I tell kids all the time, if I allow you to use the cell phone in the class and another teacher doesn't, you have to put the cell phone away. That's the rules. It's as simple as that. Just like some teachers have you sit alphabetically and others don't. It's a rule in that classroom. And I find it hard to believe that college isn't the same way. Every professor hands out his syllabus at the beginning of the year, and you all have different rules. So I don't know why that, whatever the teacher's rules are in the classroom. Now, if you as an administrator want to try to convince teachers as to why we're better off using the cell phones, well, that's a different discussion.
Well, I think I've used this analogy with you before. When I was in school, when you were in school, I would take a piece of paper out of my loose leaf and I would write a note to whoever 3 rows down. And I'd fold it up and I'd put a little, please pass to whatever, and I'd send it on its way through the carrier pigeons in the classroom. And every now and then, that note got intercepted by the teacher, 5 rows down. And sometimes they would read it out loud and embarrass you, and sometimes they would just throw it in the garbage or whatever. But at no point did the teacher ever say, Mark, don't you ever bring your notebook and paper to school again.
Right.
I don't want to see them in the classroom. So part of the issue is because it's a phone, because it's, I'll say, foreign technology or a foreign tool with a small f, And that because it's traditionally not supposed to be there. The pencil's supposed to be there, the paper's supposed to be there, the
Right.
chalkboard's supposed to be there, but the phone traditionally is not. When the teachers went to school, at least teachers who've been around for a few years or longer, they never had them in the classroom. So when they think to their own experience, they in their mind's eye, they don't see it as part of the classroom. It doesn't belong. So therefore, if a student has it and is using it for anything, therefore they're not focused on the lesson, therefore it becomes an issue or a bone of contention. Then you have on the other side teachers like yourself who want to incorporate cell phones because you realize that you can't hold back the tide. So you have to treat the misuse or the abuse of the cell phone accordingly. But now here's another thing, and there are legitimate arguments to be had. Some teachers will argue if the cell phone is out in today's day and age, I can't guarantee that the student is not recording me in one way, shape, or form and will put it on social media at the end of the day, or even while the lesson's going on. And that's an incredibly valid concern because teachers don't belong on social media unless they are putting themselves out there and it's a controlled environment.
That's a tough one for me to challenge. You're right. That's a very difficult hurdle to overcome because what I was going to say, but you went in a different direction, is if a teacher's upset because a student's distracted by the cell phone and therefore is not paying attention to the lesson. Well, my thought on that is, well, then the student's going to suffer the consequences with a lower grade. End of story. And the students have to understand that you're responsible for what's to pay attention to what's taking place in class. If you make the choice to not pay attention, you suffer. And if that means you fail, it means you fail. But then it all comes back to, but if you're failing, then it's a teacher's fault, which is a big issue because it wasn't always a teacher's fault. But now you're definitely bring up a very fair concern that who knows what is being recorded and what is being put on the internet.
That's right. And it's not even necessarily the teacher. It could be a fellow student who is just doing his or her work. So you run into a lot of those issues with the cell phone. So if they're out, then those kinds of things can happen. If they're not out, then you minimize the possibility that those things are happening.
Right.
But I also... Sorry?
Well, I'd also like to think that there's nothing going on in a classroom that would be of concern to put on the internet.
It's true.
And
but
in fairness,
you know as well as I do, you could edit things to make people look any way you want them to look.
But they could also take a video in the halls, in cafeteria duty. And there's plenty of opportunities for them to do that.
Right.
It's probably more controlled in a classroom setting because you'd be able to see if the phone is pointed directly at you. So I'm not sure if the concerns are that valid.
Right.
Any more so than
the teacher would then
else.
argue. The teacher would then argue that, well, now I have to watch for the angle of the cell phone, and now I'm not focused on the thing that I'm supposed to be doing in the classroom, which is instructing children, making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing academically, because I have yet another responsibility to oversee in the classroom. Again, it's a valid argument. There are ways to get around it, and there are ways to get past it, and it has a lot to do with the strength of the individual in the classroom. You're never going to have that problem. I say that it'll happen tomorrow, but you'll never have that problem in your classroom because of the way you manage your classroom. But not everybody manages his or her classroom with the same level of mastery that you do, and the same level of student buy-in and enthusiasm and respect that you get. But not every teacher gets that.
But like everything else, if a student does something inappropriate or wrong or against the rule, they have to be held accountable. It's not like, so what about 30 years ago when a student drew a picture of a teacher and put something really nasty about the teacher on that picture and put it up in the locker room or put it up in the hallway? If you found out who did it, shouldn't that person get punished and suspended severely for that?
Yes, absolutely.
So if we're able to figure out who did this using the cell phone, then why can't we do the same thing? And there's got to be a consequence. And you even have a policy in the beginning of the year, which I'm sure we do, where we tell kids there are consequences for this type of behavior. I just think it's very difficult to police everything. It's always been difficult, but we
Right.
managed. But now with technology, it's as if we feel like we can't police.
Well, there are two points that I'd make to that. One, it is legitimately much more difficult to police things because go back 30 years to that picture that you were talking about. That picture was in the locker room, and maybe 5 kids saw it, maybe 50 kids saw it, and then it got taken down by the teacher, and it was done. And people talked about it, but they never saw it. But now, in an instant, it could be available to the eyes of hundreds of or thousands of kids, literally in seconds. So to control it and to find it, and then take it off the internet is literally an impossibility because you can't. It's once it's out there, and you just cannot shut that down and bring it back. That's problem number one. Problem number two is when that picture was drawn, it was drawn and then it was put up there, and then let's say we found out who it was and then we took care of it and it was done. But what's happening now in classrooms is we start to get on this escalation of discipline, or this escalation of problems. It starts with put the phone away, and Johnny says no. And then teacher says, well, then give me the phone.
Yeah.
I'm the teacher. And Johnny says, my mother said I'm not to give my phone to anybody because it costs $500. And the teacher says, well, then you have to get out of my classroom. So now we've escalated from the phone is there, and let's even say the kid's not using it, but the teacher's not comfortable. The teacher doesn't want it there. Now all of a sudden we have a disciplinary issue. We have a student who's being disobedient, disrespectful, insubordinate, pick your word. And now all of a sudden we have a referral to a dean, to a chairperson, to an assistant principal, etc. And we have now a mountain from a molehill. And it happens all the time, every day in classrooms all over the place. So what I'm talking about classroom management wise is, how do we find a way, because it's hard to create a policy to fix that, because it really comes down to individuals in the heat of the moment, the child and the adult.
You know, as you're speaking, I'm saying to myself, with all the top-down mandates that we're getting in education today, that I disagree with pretty much all of them. The one thing I would love for somebody on the state or federal level to deal with is this. You're exactly right. There are schools all over this country that are all grappling with the same issue. It's not like cell phones only exist in some places.
Right.
They're in Wisconsin, they're in Michigan, they're in Texas, they're everywhere, and teachers are all facing the same hurdle. So maybe there needs to be some sort of uniform policy and approach to this in the classroom, because I don't want to lose the benefits I get from using the cell phone in the classroom. That would upset me, because I feel like I've made a lot of progress, and I know a lot of teachers have. But your concerns are so valid from the teacher standpoint and the administrative standpoint.
Yeah, well, I agree with what you're saying, and don't think I didn't pick up on the fact that you slipped Michigan in there. We keep pandering to our Michigan people, but you're 100% right. I don't know if you can control it nationally. You know, at the end of the day, it really comes down to the individual teacher and the students in that room, and how you're able to manage situations as they arise. And why is it that in certain buildings, certain teachers have issues with this frequently, and in other buildings, certain teachers never have issues with this? And they're the same students, same phones, same seats, same everything. So, you know, a lot of it does come down to, like everything else that revolving around classroom management, it does come down to the individual teacher and his or her ability to kind of massage a situation to try to get the best possible outcome while de-escalating instead of escalating. But sometimes that doesn't work out, and then we wind up with discipline problems. And I can only imagine what goes on in other buildings elsewhere. They probably depends on the building, but I'm sure in some schools it's probably a huge problem. But I don't want teachers to say the bell just rang, put your cell phones away. I prefer that they take your approach. The bell just rang, or the bell has rung. Take your cell phones out, because we're going to help we're going to use them to help us learn whatever it is that we're learning today, because they're incredible tools.
Yeah.
So why would we take literally, I say this to my kids all the time. You have in your hand the most powerful device that's ever been created in the history of mankind. So why would we want to take that powerful tool and pretend it doesn't exist? We have to figure out ways to utilize it. We have to figure out ways for students to respect the boundaries that are going to be imposed in the classroom and work from a place of strength, instead of trying to run in fear and create policies to try to prevent the worst case scenario.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
All right, so let's go from one problem that's impossible to solve to another problem that's impossible to solve. In the methods lab, I wanted to talk about Attire, and this has been something that I have changed my tune on over the years, and but I wanted to get your take on it. So let's start with the students. Is a student dress code beneficial?
Ooh. Um, my initial answer would be no. My initial response would be I don't think a dress code. Well, first I would say, what are you trying to prove with a dress code? What's your goal?
Okay, well, there was an article that was pretty interesting that I came across. I'll put a link to it on the show notes, that talks about the pros and cons of school uniforms. So let me read a few of them to you and see if you agree with the pros and cons. So here are the proponents of school uniforms. Help prevent gangs from forming on campus, encourage discipline, help students resist peer pressure to buy trendy clothes, help identify intruders in the school, diminish economic and social barriers between students, increase a sense of belonging and school pride, and improve attendance. That's a lot. You're asking a lot from a shirt.
That is a lot.
Um, so what are your thoughts about the proponents' arguments in
I
favor of school uniforms?
Well, okay. I think I agree with it. Definitely takes pressure off of kids who maybe can't afford the type of clothing that everybody's wearing, if that's what one of their points is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really think it does anything to stem gang participation. Um, that one I don't think I'm going to go with. Um, I I think it's trying to solve. I'll put it to you this way: when you have a child and he's really not doing well in school, there's a lot of behavior problems, and or hanging out with kids as a parent you're not happy with. Sometimes parents will take the kid out of school, put him in Catholic school, and they think that's going to just solve the problem. You're not really getting to the root of the problem. You're not getting
Right.
to the behavior. They're still going to be hanging out with the same kids. You're not moving. You're still living in the same town. They're only going to be in school for part of the day. So I don't feel as if the uniform necessarily addresses the root of the problem, which is the bad behavior. I think it's putting a mask over it.
Yeah, I think you're making a very strong point. As a matter of fact, one of the arguments that the opponents give, and according to this article, I guess I'll read them as well, is one is putting a band-aid on the issues, in particular of school violence, violating a student's right to freedom of expression. That one's a little much of a stretch, if you ask me, because we all know that there are, of course, the Constitution exists inside the school, but it is modified and augmented a little bit because of the nature of the school building. The courts have established that over many, many years of case law. Make students a target for bullies from other schools. Again, I think it's a bit of a stretch. Are a financial burden for poor families. Are an unfair additional expense for parents who pay taxes for a free public education. And are difficult to enforce in public schools. So what are your thoughts of the people who oppose school
Yeah,
uniforms?
well, I can, just like you talked about the cell phone and the enforcement of that, I can just see now teachers coming down to the office. Well, he was supposed to have the button tied, buttoned all the way to the top, but he had 2 buttons undone. Or, she was supposed to have the skirt, 3 inches below the knee, but it was 1.5 inches. I mean, and here we go again, creating these problems for administration. So
Well, listen, I used to walk, as it happened to be, when I would walk to school, when I was in junior high school. very often the timing of my route, I would find myself behind a girl who was going to Catholic school, and as she walked to school, the dress would get higher and higher and
Right.
higher as she rolled it up. Now I'm not complaining, but this is what I saw. And then on the way home, it would get lower and lower and lower by the time she got to her house. So even with uniforms, like you said, kids will do whatever they can to personalize it and make it fit whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish, whether it's trying to be a little bit more provocative or a little bit cooler or a little tougher or a little whatever it is. They will try to find these little subtle ways, and kids will notice those things
Right.
because they're all wearing the same uniform.
And if a child wants to go to a school with a dress code, or a parent wants them to go, there are options. I remember my cousin went to an all boys Catholic school for 3 years, and then the senior year, the school became co-ed. And he still says to this day, once it went co-ed, that's when the school, in his eyes, started to go down, because he said being in the all-male environment for him, there were no distractions. You don't have to worry about, you put the uniform on, but you didn't care how you looked. It didn't matter. And,
Right.
and if that's your choice, then you have those options. But to make it for everybody, it's been the public schools, I feel like what they're trying to accomplish won't be solved. They're trying to improve behavior, I think. I think that's what, and I don't think. Now, are we talking about behavior, or are we talking about inappropriate dress? Because that's a different issue.
Right. Well, let's talk about
Yeah.
inappropriate dress in a second, but just to finish up the point that you were making. But you'll see on television they'll cover the charter schools in Harlem, for example, and you'll see what's supposed to be this very difficult socioeconomic group that they're working with, who have, perhaps for a period of time, not had the academic success as a community that they would have hoped, and now all of a sudden you see images of all of the kids wearing the same exact clothes, and they're talking about how that's making a difference, and now because of that everything is aligned and they have a certain standard. And I feel like that those images send the wrong message. They're selling a bill of goods because it's making it appear as though it's the uniform that's making the difference for the kids. And I don't believe, like you, I don't believe that the uniforms are make enough of a difference to make them worthwhile, and to you have to take all the bad with the good, or the good with the bad. I just don't think there's enough upside to make it worth it, make it worth the expense, make it worth the behavior problems, in terms of students, not behavior, excuse me, that they're not wearing the uniform, and then you have to deal with that administratively. You have to deal with angry parents who can't afford it, or who don't agree with it, or think it violates students' rights, et
Right.
cetera, et cetera. I just don't think you get enough upside to have to tolerate and deal with all the downside that you
Right.
get.
And somebody might counter the argument you were presenting, not your argument, but they might counter it by saying that in the Baltimore protests, those were high school students who were wearing uniforms.
That's right.
Now that's a whole other issue. The protests. I don't even want to get into that. But the fact is that there were kids violating the law wearing uniforms. So you're going to see people go back and forth, with the discussion in that way.
Right. But then you mentioned the other point, which is inappropriate
Right.
dress. Now, I think this one's a little bit easier to tackle, because I think it's fair to say that there are examples of inappropriate dress in a classroom or in a school building, and those have to be handled and addressed, because you just can't have those kinds of disruptions in the school building.
I agree. I think, but again, I'm not in an administrative position, but I think those are better dealt with on a one-to-one basis, meaning you see the inappropriate dress, and then
Hmm.
somebody's got to have a discussion with that student, maybe with the parents as well,
Right.
about it.
Which we do.
Yeah, because I think making the blanket statement over the loudspeaker sometimes, that only riles up the kids a little bit more.
Right.
Whereas if you just notice what you find inappropriate and bring it to their attention, and try to explain that it's in their own best interest for why you're bringing this up.
Right. That argument doesn't necessarily
I know
go as
it's
well.
difficult, and it's very difficult.
Because if they understood what's in their own best interest, they wouldn't show up to school wearing what it is that they're wearing, whether it be the message that's on the clothing or how provocative the clothing might be, how revealing. You'd be surprised. I mean, you wouldn't be surprised, but it amazes me sometimes how they leave the house. Sometimes parents see it. Very often they don't. They're changing in the bathroom or
Right.
they're changing at a friend's house. So I can't put that on the parents because when the child's leaving, everything looks like it's all well and good. All right, so let's flip the script. And now we talked about student dress code. Now let's talk about teacher dress code and administrator dress code. So I've come 180 degrees on this. When I first started teaching, I didn't necessarily see why it was necessary. Not that I dressed inappropriately, but I never saw from a male perspective why a shirt and tie was necessary. I've come completely to the other side of the argument where I just can't understand why. I'll just take men for a minute. Why they don't wear a shirt and a tie to work every single day, and I'll lay out my argument. One of my arguments: dressing the part automatically, in the eyes of young people, garners a certain amount of respect without you saying a word. It just says something without saying anything. And why you wouldn't want to get any advantage, any edge that you can over students who can be challenging. Let's face it. I mean, we happen to work at very nice schools. Some schools, people wake up when the alarm rings. They almost want to go run and leave the country because they just know that they're going. What's waiting for them when they leave the house and get into their place of work. We're very fortunate. We don't have that. But there are people who do that. Why would you not want to get every single advantage that you can in terms of garnering and earning the respect of young people so they will do as you ask, and as long as what you're doing asking is fair, of course. Why wouldn't you do that? I just it drives me crazy, and I'll just give you a perfect example. If I walk on an airplane and the pilot is wearing shorts and a t-shirt, I don't know how comfortable I'd feel. And he could be the greatest, or she could be the greatest pilot on Earth. But the image that I get and the impression that I get is that I'm in really unsteady, perhaps incapable hands. Is it right? Probably not, but it's real. And I just don't know why teachers wouldn't do the same to give themselves all the edges and all the advantages that they possibly can professionally.
So with
I have
that,
many other arguments, but I'll hand off to you now.
so with that argument, can I wear shirt and tie until I have them all convinced that I'm a great teacher, and then I can show up in shorts?
No.
I well, I think I generally agree with you, with a couple of exceptions. Hot weather days, our schools are not air conditioned. I think that's asking a little bit too much.
Okay.
And I mean those really brutal days. I
Right.
don't think teachers should be uncomfortable either. So, but I think, and I also think, while your suggestions that you offer and your reasons why are very valid, I don't know if I can necessarily see enforcing it as a policy.
Well, this is what drives me crazy because let's just take the $15 an hour movement for fast food workers. Okay. Now they are making some cases $7, $8 an hour. They're begging to make 15. Not begging. They're fighting
Yeah.
to make 15. These people who are making, in some cases, the most minimum of wages, poverty wages in some cases, when their manager tells them to put on a uniform, they put it on. And if they don't get to keep their jobs. Teachers are making $40, $50, $60, $70 an hour, hundreds of dollars a day in many places like where we work on Long Island, over $100,000 a year, which by pretty much all standards is a very nice living. It's not Donald Trump. It's not Bloomberg, but it's certainly a comfortable lifestyle and a comfortable living. And if they're asked to wear appropriate attire for work, That should not be an issue. When the rest of the world, when they're asked by their employer to wear a uniform, whether it's the Cheesecake Factory or McDonald's or American Airlines, they all do it. I don't know if they complain or not, but they show up to work in uniforms. Police show up to work in uniforms. Firefighters show up to work in uniforms. They do. And it makes a difference. And why teachers think, for whatever reason, and I was one of them, but I was wrong. Why teachers think that for some reason they are holier than thou and they get to basically say no boggles my mind. And why it's allowed, I mean, I know why it's allowed because of unions, but there are lots of other unions out there and those workers are wearing uniforms. I don't know where we lost our way in education where it's not okay to wear whatever is considered to be professional attire. Because you know as well as I do, we have people in all schools everywhere who dress completely unprofessionally. And they expect to get respect in the classroom, but yet they have done nothing professionally in terms of their appearance to garner that respect. But they'll be the first one to complain that the student did not issue the respect that they believe they deserve. And it's hypocritical, and I have a major problem with it.
Well, hold on. I got to go upstairs and put a shirt and tie on because I'm a little bit intimidated right now. Okay, so but I am going to respond. My point would be this. While I agree that it is beneficial for teachers to dress more professionally, and while I would encourage them to do so and give the reasons like you have very nicely done, in terms of the administrator-teacher relationship that exists that we can't change, I'd rather cash in my chips elsewhere. There are other things that teachers are not doing that I would rather focus on. That would be, without getting too specific right now, that would be, so while I agree and while I would encourage, because if you encourage and get more people on board, and I know we're both men, so we're using the male attire as the example. If more men are wearing shirt and ties in the classroom, the ones who are not are going to stand out. And there's going to be, through, let's call it peer pressure, but there's going to be more of a feeling that they should move to the other side that way. But there are other things that teachers are not doing educationally. Using,
of course,
using electronic gradebook. That's where I want to cash in my chips. That's where I want to use my leverage on. If that makes sense to you, it's because
it does. But I don't know why we should have to sacrifice one for the other.
Because you do. Because unfortunately, it's the system we have. It goes back to our first or second podcast. We have tenure. We have job protection. We've talked about how this should be addressed and changed, but it isn't. So we're living in the here and now. So you can come to school, now again, I'm saying you, it's the plural you, everybody.
Sure.
You can come to school and say, I want every teacher to wear a shirt and tie. You can do that. You can instill it. You can make it a policy. And what you're going to do is you're going to get backlash from some people. Who do they think they are telling me how I can dress? Whereas I'd rather come to school and say, we have this brand new program, okay, and it's really great. And parents can now go online and they could see the running grade of their students. So instead of us having to constantly tell you to call parents home when they're not doing well, we can now put the onus on parents to simply log in. What does that mean we need from you? We just need you to keep the grade book online. To me, that's where I want to sell teachers. And I'm just giving you the example that came off the top of my head.
Sure.
That's what I want because I see direct value. Again, I'm not disagreeing with you on the dress, but I see, oh my God, the improvements, and of course schools already do this, the improvements in education that could be made if parents and teachers and students can all see the running total of their averages throughout the semester. No surprises anymore. No end of the year. Who can Johnny do this? No, here it is. But that requires teachers to do something that they haven't been doing. That's what I want to sell them on, not the dress code.
Well, we're going to have to save electronic gradebook for another discussion because there are different elements there that I want to share from the administrative side that are a bit nightmarish. But I'll save that for a future
No
podcast. But
problem.
I hear what you're saying, and I do understand that in the system that you have limited chips and you do have to use them accordingly. But it just is disheartening and disappointing that professionally speaking, people wouldn't want to give themselves the leg up, and of course many do, but I'm talking about the ones who don't. Um, and I just don't understand why they would want to do that to themselves. It belittles their own profession, and it does. And I don't care what anybody tells me. It diminishes the level of authority and respect that you have in that building, in front of that classroom, even if it's just by 1 degree or 1 iota or one increment. It does, because they look at you differently. The way that you would look at the pilot differently, the way that you would look at the police officer differently, the way that you would look at the waiter differently, the way that you would look at the banker differently. It just, there are certain expectations, and there are certain things and perceptions that we have, and we want to see them satisfied when we interact with these various professional people. And when teachers think that that doesn't matter or apply to them because they have it all going on in their mind, and it's about my lesson and everything. Yeah, of course it is. All those things are incredibly important. But why wouldn't you go that extra little bit, because it's just a little bit, to make it complete? And why you would leave it out there, and represent yourself that way is beyond me. I just don't understand.
Okay, I'll let you have the last word.
Okay, well, thank you for letting me get that off my chest. I appreciate it. But so that wraps up our podcast for today. If you, as always, would like to follow us on iTunes, we're available in the iTunes store. Please subscribe at State of Ed Podcast. You could also find us on the web at stateofedpodcast.com. Any questions, or you'd like to suggest a topic, it's ask at stateofedpodcast.com. We're also on Twitter at SOE Podcast. And I'm really excited because we have a surprise for our next episode, but I'm not going to give anything away. But I'm really, really very much looking forward to it. And I think it's going to be a whole lot of fun.
I would agree with that.
So I wish you a very enjoyable, relaxing week. And until next time,
All right, Mark, take care.
have a good one.